Hey guys, welcome back to Meghan Grace DIY. Today's video is going to be a little bit less tutorial and a little bit more blog. I'm going to share with you guys some of the things I've been doing over the past week or so to help mass produce masks for all my friends and loved ones and for our healthcare workers. First things first, this is a shot at my local Walmart. As you can see, a lot of the fabric has been cleared out. Any fabric that you actually see in the shot is fabric that's not really appropriate for a mask. It's usually home decor, or you can see some netting there or some fleece, but anything that's appropriate for a mask has been completely wiped out. So to get fabric for masks, a lot of us are getting donations from friends that have fabric stock, or using sheets, or clearing out fabric in our own stock. Another really cool thing, but if you're looking for a sewing machine, it's not a cool thing, is the fact that sewing machines are completely sold out too. Makes me feel good because maybe our art is becoming more popular. And as someone who's sewn my whole life, I really like to see more people picking up sewing. So first things first, when you get your fabric home, please make sure you give it a good press. If it has any kind of wrinkles or folds or bumps, it's going to make cutting it quite a bit harder and it's going to slow you down. I usually tend to cut with my fabric folded in half and cut 2 masks at a time. When I've tried to cut 4 before, I find it becomes a lot more inaccurate, and then I have to do a lot more cleanup work later on. So again, saves me time to do a more accurate cut first, and then to go back and clean up later. And before I get grief for making Patriots masks, I just want to let everyone out there know that if you were lucky enough to get a team mask, that kind of fabric is actually way more expensive than regular cotton because it's licensed by the NFL. So I pulled all my team fabric out of my closet and I gave it away to friends. So, stop and thank a seamstress, because that fabric tends to be about 4 times as expensive as a regular cotton. In this session, I basically kept cutting until I reached the end of this piece of fabric, and then I went ahead and I cut out the fabric that I would use for the inside of the mask. I believe in total I had cut out about 75 masks in this one day. So then one more quick trick I want to show you here is any type of fabric that's a woven will most likely rip on the grain. So you can do something called snip and rip if you want to get a straight line to start with. So I snipped the edge of the hem there. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to rip it and see how it just rips nice and easy for me. And that's how I know I'm starting with a nice straight edge when I go to cut my fabric. So here I'm taking from my 2 piles, the pile that's the inside of the mask and the pile that's the outside of the mask, and I'm just kind of layering them into sandwiches, so that way when I go over to the machine, they're already paired together and I can send them through the machine more quickly. And yes, I am sewing in a Snuggie and slippers, because if you're gonna sew for 14 hours, you may as well be comfortable. So what I'm gonna do here is I take all of my pairs of fabric and I'm gonna send them through the machine to sew that one side seam that needs to be sewn, and I send them through one right after the other. Now, a lot of people looking at this might say, well, what about your stay stitching or your lock stitching that would happen at the front and the back of the seam? It's really okay to not have a back stitch here, because when you go ahead and zigzag the sides, that's gonna lock the seam in place for you. After I've sent maybe 20 masks through the machine, I'll stop and I'll go ahead and I'll cut the little piece of thread that's basically tying them all together. Another really good thing about sending them through one after the other is you save thread from pulling each mask out of the machine. Then you have to cut the tail, and then you're kind of just wasting a little bit of thread, because when you're mass producing these masks, you start to go through thread really, really, really fast. So after I get all these masks cut apart, we'll be ready to go over to the ironing board. So this part is by far my least favorite part. It takes a very, very long time. I haven't really found a great way to streamline this yet, but I have to go over to the iron and open up the seam that I sewed, and then also sew each side of the mask, press it at a 1/2 inch down. And then I take the mask and I put it back into its sandwich form and I press it one more time. I also take this time to clean up the edges. If maybe one side is a 1/4 inch bigger than the other, I'll trim it. And if you see me just kind of flicking the extra fabric or thread onto the floor, I'm not super messy. It's just a lot easier for me to put it onto the wooden floor, and then I sweep up after. Well, on this day, I pressed about 75 masks, and all in all, it took me about 4.5 hours to get through all of that. So some people really like ironing. I don't mind doing it if I'm doing 1 or maybe 10 masks, but when it was 75 masks, it got to be pretty tiring by the end. But I also believe it's important that if you have a step that you don't really like to do, you might as well just kind of get it all over at once. So that's what I really tried to do here, was to just kind of work through it, get it done, and then that way I could move on to the next step. On the bright side, the steam from the iron did give me a very nice facial. For the masks that I donated, I switched back and forth between using elastic for the ears and using ties. I prefer elastic simply because it is faster. I know you can use ribbon instead of ties, but I feel that ribbon sometimes can get tangled a lot easier, so I would rip sheets and actually make my own cotton ties. So what you see me doing here is taking a strip of cotton that I ripped from a sheet that was about 1.5 inches wide. I fold it in half in the middle and then fold both sides inward and basically sew it along the right-hand side to create a tie. I found that in sewing basically one strip that I ripped from the full length of the sheet, I could get about 4 ties or 1 mask worth of ties out of that sewing session. So again, when we're talking about mass producing, making the ties for 1 mask would take me about 10 minutes. So that means I would get about 6 masks worth of ties done per hour. That starts to really add up if you're trying to make a really big group to send out to people. So here you can see all the ties that I made for masks. I pre-cut them, and then I also pre-cut my velcro that I was going to use to be able to open up the masks to put filters in, and I pre-cut my elastic. So when it comes to putting in the velcro, I did use significantly less velcro than I used in my initial tutorial. After talking to my friend who is a nurse at the hospital I was donating them to, she said as long as they had enough, about 2-3 fingers wide, to actually close the mask, then that was fine. And I was trying to conserve the velcro that I had to make it spread across as many masks as possible. And don't worry, I won't sew over Rosie's tail. I actually really like when she hangs out with me at my sewing table. So another time-saving measure that I took when I was sewing in the velcro was I would take the piece of velcro and place it in the middle of the side of the mask that I was attaching it to, as you see here. I would sew down the right side and then stop, take the mask out from under the machine, and then I would go ahead and sew down the left side of that folded over piece of fabric. As I'm sewing, I sew down the other side of the velcro. So now I've accomplished 2 steps at once by sewing down the flap of fabric and also sewing down the side of the velcro. Then repeat the same procedure for the other side of the mask, and then I close the mask and get it ready to be zigzagged on the sides. Now that all my velcro is sewn on, I folded all my masks back into their sandwich shape, and I'm gonna go ahead and zigzag the sides. This is another step that you can just send it through the machine, mask after mask after mask. It helps save you time in pulling the mask out of the machine, and it also helps save you thread by not having tails on every single one of your masks. After you've got all the zigzags completed for one side, you can pull them out of the machine and cut that little hanging piece of thread apart. Then you're going to go ahead and repeat this process for the other side. And back to the iron we go. Next, I'm going to just press our pleats into our mask. We're just taking 2 big folds that go horizontally across the mask, and we press them in place. And then once I'm done with a certain mask, I put them to the side and I layer them in opposite directions so they're easier to bring back to the machine. As I start to round the end, I start to get really excited about all the work that I've done. And we're basically at the last step here where we're just going to fold each edge over and attach either a tie or an elastic. Again, one more step where we can just go mask, mask, mask in a row if you'd like, but it is really important that if you're going to do that, that you do back stitch and front stitch at each tie or elastic point. Since there's so much pressure put there, we want to make sure that those ties and that elastic is really going to stay in place. So you can see right here, I'm gonna go forward, back, and forward again over the tie. Make sure it's really not gonna come off. And there you have it. That's how I mass produce masks. Basically, once you're done, you can sit back and be proud of yourself for all the hard work that you just did. In these days where wearing a mask has suddenly become a daily requirement, one of the small things that we can do if we know how to sew is to make masks for others. I've been really happy during this time to be able to share my talents not only with local healthcare workers, but with the people that are most important to me in my life. If you found this tutorial helpful in any way, I'd love to see pictures posted below of the things that you've made using the tips I've shared today. I hope you'll stop back by my channel for another tutorial, and in the meantime, be safe and stay well.